What is liberation theology? A lot of folks perhaps have heard the term or heard the phrase, and maybe you have just thought it was, something that was a kind of theology that was emerging out of the communities of people of color or poor people, or maybe it's something that, since it isn't orthodox, so to speak, something that you didn't have to pay attention to. But at its core, liberation theology is theology that takes seriously the realities of suffering and oppression of people who claim themselves to be Christian, but just people that are suffering in the world. And this is what we're going to talk about today. One of the challenges that I think that many people have, many American Christians especially have with liberation theology, is the way in which it obviously blends religion and politics. Now, as Christians, as people who strive to practice the religion of Jesus and engage the Bible honestly, I think we would do well to understand that the Bible is both personal and political. There is no reading the Bible that doesn't wrestle with the reality of these two truths. Now, while some of you may have been taught that our faith and our politics should be separate, or at least maybe our faith and our politics should be unspoken, both the biblical record and our Christian tradition tell us a different story. Now, this twofold affirmation that the Bible is both personal and political, again, is clear beginning, quite honestly, in Exodus. The Bible is personal because it concerns our relationship to God as persons. This relationship is a path of personal transformation. It is the way of return from exile, the recovery of sight to the blind, the liberation from bondage. This is Jesus' spiritual path of radical compassion, and practicing it leads us towards a new beginning, a new life centered in God. Now, the Bible is also political because it reflects God's desire for a different kind of world, a different kind of political structure and engagement with the world, a world of abundance rather than scarcity, where people have enough not due to charity, but through justice. A world where nations no longer wage war against one another, and in a world where we recognize God pulling us, like longing for us and inviting us to envision a world where marginalization and exploitation do not feel normal. This is the theme of the Bible that you see evident just in the Exodus narrative, where God disrupts a political system of oppression, right? By inviting and saying, I've heard the cries of my people, and I want this figure, this person, Moses, and his sister and brother to liberate my people. This is a political act, and it is a personal act. And this context of Mosaic religion is evident throughout the entire Bible, and particularly in the life, ministry, and teachings of Jesus. Anybody who approaches the Bible with honesty can reach this conclusion. And so for oppressed and marginalized folks in the world who felt as though Christianity didn't reach this conclusion, that the Christianity that surrounded them was leaving them behind and not taking their suffering seriously, they created something different, something that several of them have come to define as liberation theology. And so in today's episode, we're going to talk about two key figures in the creation of liberation theology and what legacy they have left behind, and how some of us are building on that legacy to create a new church, a new community that we hope is a better reflection of the beloved community. Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christian Podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians, and not the kind who take their private jet that's funded by tax dollars and create a room where they can have an affair with their assistant. So, if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I'm your host, and I am a professor of theology and the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community in Los Angeles. And today I am joined by
Reverend Blair,
Everest,
and Julia. Wait, I haven't been listening to the news. I haven't been watching.
I'm going to need story time.
What were you referring to? Whom?
So, for those of you, I know you said you need to get a little bit more information. So you have Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski. Now, Corey, again, was one of the lead campaign folks for Donald Trump. and they are allegedly having an affair. Allegedly, according to the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, and other outlets. Now, she has this deportation plane that she's been flying all over the country, because this is a part of a broader project in her mind to set herself up to run for president. That's what she's trying to do. And so because he helped Donald Trump get elected, he's thinking about electing her, all these other kind of things. And essentially they changed the configuration of an airplane that they've been using for deportations to have one might say a love nest in the back. So that way they could spend time together on these deportation flights. So yes.
Crazy
so they throw the migrants in the front and they're hanging out in the back.
I don't know if it's before or after. I don't know, man. I don't know. It is
either way, wild. It's a misappropriation of government.
It is definitely a misappropriation of government funds. And I think, again, I always go back to and I know people have been saying this forever. It's like the thing they're accusing you of is the thing they're doing. That's how I keep going. I'm just
accusation is always
an admission. Yeah, I'm just always. It's so wild, right? And there's a part of me that's just like, hey, man, I ain't trying to be nobody. Like, you want to do what you need to do, do you. You know what I'm saying? But don't then come around and try to talk about all this religious stuff, to talk about morality and to shame people, right? I think that's the part that it's so disingenuous. That's the part that makes me frustrated. So
yeah, like have your extramarital affairs. Like no one is judging you for that, but you judge other people.
Exactly. Didn't Jesus say this is why you're not supposed to judge because then people are going to judge you? Like I know somewhere in the Bible, this is what it say. Anyway, I just thought I read that. Now, I'm always trying to figure out funny ways to start the show. And I was like, this is crazy. This is wild.
Still not the craziest thing. Still not there's still more crazy things. That's to me, the craziest thing is you could say the craziest, most outlandish thing. And that you can still, if you read more news, find something actually crazier.
That's fair. I think that's fair. That's fair. This isn't going to be a podcast about extramarital affairs or anything like that. We are actually talking about liberation theology and the ways in which, kind of how it emerged and how it continues to shape and inform, honestly, a lot of progressive theology today. Contemporary progressive theology has its roots in liberation theology. Social gospel to an extent, but I would say liberation theology specifically. I want to do a couple of quick shout outs. We've been getting a lot of comments on our Spotify and YouTube, and thank you all for leaving comments, and I'm trying to engage them fairly quickly. And I appreciate the love. And, sometimes I forget that we have a good amount, I suspect, of moderate and maybe even slightly conservative listeners. And I just think sometimes I'm really proud of that fact, but I know I can forget it. And so someone made a comment around what we said around IVF, and we're like, this isn't really a good faith, or you could have said more last week about it. And I tried to reply, and I was charitable. I was like, well, we weren't really trying to get into the weeds. We were trying to, at that point, wrap up the podcast. And this person is Roman Catholic. Then I got to a great conversation around Roman Catholic positions, because I would argue they do have some of the most well theologically thought out perspectives on fertility, because it's been part of the tradition for a long time, and that's something I can actually acknowledge. I do think we need to have a couple of Catholic scholars on here, because we're all Protestants and we're almost forget this whole other way of practicing Christianity. But he recommended another Catholic scholar that I'm gonna try to reach out to, and I just want to give a shout out to him or her, actually, because I don't know who it is. I shouldn't say it, to them, and really just thank you for listening, and also thank you for reminding me that, one of the benefits, or what I hope of the way we're trying to have these conversations, is that people who don't necessarily agree with us can feel like they can listen and not feel like we're shutting them down, because we're not trying to, because we don't all agree, it's evident. And I love that about this show. So the bulk of the conversation around liberation theology is built around two of the kind of pioneers of liberation theology, James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez. The primary source we're using to talk about some of the main key arguments of liberation theology is Cone's book, A Black Theology of Liberation, which was published in 1970. James Cone was born in Arkansas in 1938. He actively talked about how Jim Crow shaped his life and his theology. He is an African Methodist Episcopal pastor, or he was, I should say. He taught at Union Theological Seminary, and he died just, I think, in 2018, so not too long ago. I had the opportunity to speak and meet with him a few times, speak with him a few times, and count myself fortunate and blessed, honestly, to have met one of the pillars of theology. Because quite honestly, now that he's passed, a lot of his work is getting taken up by systematic theology, because at his core, he's a great theologian, even though he talked about liberation specifically. And then also Gustavo Gutierrez, who was born in Peru in 1928. He is a Dominican, or he was a Dominican priest, a Roman Catholic theologian. Working with the poor and oppressed and marginalized in South America really shaped his life and his theology. He taught in lots of places. In America, he taught at the University of Notre Dame. In his book, A Theology of Liberation, was published in 1971. And so you have these two like theological movements emerging at the same time, even though they're not technically initially in conversation with each other, but really wrestling with the reality of the experience of the oppressed. Now, some of you may be wondering why there is such a thing as liberation theology. Like, why are we even having this conversation? Why isn't there just like theology as such? And so both Cohn and Gutierrez argue in their own particular ways that liberation theology emerges because of Euro-American Christianity's unwillingness to relate the gospel of Jesus to the oppressed people of color, specifically Black and South America, Latinx, and indigenous people. So their argument from the beginnings of both their books are like, liberation theology is the only reason we have it is because traditional orthodox theologies, quote unquote, haven't taken the suffering of poor people, and particularly people of color, seriously. And so we have to find a different way to do theology, because the way theology is being done right now is clearly flawed and is problematic. So I'm curious, just as a base assumption, what comes up for y'all as this kind of argument as to why this kind of theology is necessary, or why it emerged at all.
When I found liberation theology for the first time, I just felt really vindicated in the way that I was already reading the Bible. I think that for my young non-theology reading life, I didn't really understand how the text that I had, I didn't know how to reconcile it with the kind of legacy of domination that it had been used for. It didn't make any sense to me. And I think when I read the stories in the Bible, the big stories and just the narrative of Jesus and the kind of ministry that Jesus had, and learning that Jesus was a human manifestation of what God would be like in a human body, I was like, this just doesn't. Anyway, I think there was a lot of things about Christianity that just, like Christianity, the institution, that didn't make sense to me. And when I found liberation theology, it felt like it just made sense to me and how I had been reading the Bible. So I think that it makes sense that as this text was being used to kind of control and dominate people, that when the people gained access to the text and the stories, they were like, wait a second, this play is about us.
Yeah, no, Everest, I think that makes so much sense. I think I was fortunate enough, I didn't know that as a growing up in a church that the way in which we theologize collectively was a liberationist perspective, because the pastors that I grew up with had went to ITC, so that's the Interdenominational Theological Seminary or Center in Atlanta and in Candler. And so they were exposed to this kind of way of thinking theologically, Black educated pastors, that lived in the South. And so for me, it was just like normal, I think, more than anything else. I was like, oh, this is just, I didn't know there was another way. Like, I'll be honest with you, like I did not know. And not to say that again, and we're going to get into some of the structure, some of the issues with some way people are applying this. But I think for me, it was just like a normal way to think theologically. Julia?
Yeah, I affirm what you just said, because I didn't know so much of like my post deconstruction, like reconstruction life has been trying to understand the fact that like I'm like the inside out of Everest, of like I'm the opposite of like I grew up in it, and it's really difficult for me to understand. I don't understand how other people I hear, this is why I'm always asking questions like, what do they think? Because it's the opposite of what I grew up in, not recognizing it as like a specific lens or hermeneutic or like theological understanding, just thinking that this is what Christianity is.
Yeah, I'm really curious, Blair, like if you would, in looking back in your own particular upbringing in the church, even though it's a progressive church, it was a predominantly white church, do you felt like there were these themes there, or was this something you really weren't exposed to until you got to seminary?
I definitely was raised with the theology of liberation as the core of the message of the gospel, right? That Jesus came not to wash away our sins. That wasn't the kind of language that got used in my spaces, the spaces I was raised in, but rather to Luke 4, to liberate the oppressed and let the prisoners go free, blind shall see, all those things, right? Like things that are life transforming things is what marked the kingdom of God. And so I think too, we're talking about liberation theology as an academic, like when did it start as an academic strand of theology? The reality is, especially Black folks in America have been doing liberation theology for a long time, right? The idea that the main story of the gospel is this kind of Luke 4 model text of Jesus came not to save the individual, but to save the community. And we see the development of this academic theology in James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez. I also want to shout out Rubem Alves, who often gets overlooked, but his dissertation at Union was towards a theology of liberation. And the book was published as a theology of human hope. And so he often gets left out of these, but it was published the year before. Gustavo Gutierrez and Rubem Alves was a Brazilian theologian who studied with Jürgen Moltmann at Union. And Jürgen Moltmann was part of this strand of thinking in European post-World War II theological circles, trying to figure out how can we continue to follow a religion that led to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so there were white theologians who were trying to grapple with this as well, in conversation with theologians from South America, with Black Americans. And then Mary Daly, who's a Catholic theologian, wrote Beyond God the Father in the same time period, these late 60s, early 70s. And so the sort of political moment of the post-World War II, post-colonial reckoning with human evil, the human propensity for evil, led to this explosion of theological academic exploration of suffering and hope and liberation. But the idea that the story of Christianity is primarily a story of liberation is an ancient one. It's not necessarily a new one.
And I think, it's not lost on me, because now I'm like channeling Cone, that white people start taking this theology of liberation more seriously when they see other white Europeans suffering and using religion to justify that suffering, right? Like
absolutely,
that's 100%. Like I can hear his high
pitched
voice
it's like
saying that in my head, right?
Academically, that's part of what opened this up. It's not to say that, like, if you read theology from Black folks in the antebellum America, they are doing liberation theology. The Academy just didn't recognize it, as you said, until other white people were recognizing it.
Harriet Tubman was called Moses.
Yeah. I mean, Harriet Tubman, To Join the Truth. If you read this, there's a tiny pamphlet called David Walker's Appeal. I mean, these are what we would call liberation theology. And
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah. And I think, I'm so glad you actually said this, and thank you for bringing this up. It is, and even I would say, and I wish I had my colleague Santiago, he's a South American scholar, to talk about the indigenous blend of their religious with Roman Catholicism that he would argue is doing kind of the same thing, like recognizing that the way in which they were understanding what the text said was different than what they were being taught. And so you have these movements of liberation and of what we would now call liberation theology happening because they were trying to reconcile their own experience of God with what the text says and what they were experiencing from the church. And so they're disrupting it already. This is when it becomes, I don't even say accepted in the academy, because it wasn't. It's when it gets published in the academy. But on a practical level, the kind of theology these communities were doing is a theology of anti-oppression, a theology of liberation. And so this is when it gets into maybe the mainstream, broadly speaking, but it was always there. So no, that's such a great point. And so this kind of helps me transition a little bit into, for them, they see this as the content of theology, right? Both Cone and Gutierrez would argue that liberation at its core is what theology is. So Cohn writes that Christian theology is a theology of liberation. It is a rational study of the being of God in the world in light of the existential situation of the oppressed community, relating the forces of liberation to the essence of the gospel, which is Jesus Christ. And Gutierrez says that theology is a critical reflection on Christian praxis in light of the word. And for him, it's capital WORD. So he's talking about Jesus, right? The word of God.
The logos, not the word on the page.
Exactly. And so for him, he's much more concerned with orthopraxy, so right practice, than orthodoxy, than right belief. He's like, it's like, looking at the book of James, it's like, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And essentially the pertinent questions of theology for him arise out of the struggle for human freedom and justice. And both of them look at the Exodus narrative. They look at God intervening and seeing the suffering of God's people and saying, no, I'm going to respond and do something about this. And they see this as both a personal and political act. And they're like, this is the essence. This is when revelation happens. And this, so we know that God is a God of liberation because God's intervening moment that creates like Judaism as such begins in this powerful moment. And so for them, it's like, this is what theology is. And we've just kind of missed the boat. In addition to drawing from those passages, I guess maybe it might be helpful to spend a little bit more time kind of teasing out why for them it's that way. And it is primarily because of their interpretation of the Bible and how that's important for them, because they were also critiqued as being too political, which is, if you listen to the monologue, like that is ostensibly their understanding was that you just can't separate these two. And so as they understand it, they would argue the biblical tradition makes it clear that God is a God of liberation, and that liberation from oppression is core to the message of Jesus and is what's a part of moving us toward the beloved community. And they see this in God's election of the Israelite people, in terms of the people that are oppressed, who are enslaved and liberated, the prophetic tradition of the Israelite faith. And when you read the prophets, you see the ways in which not only are they serving as like a corrective to, often we perceive the prophets as correcting Israel for worshiping other gods, when in fact, that may be a part of it. The broader correction they're making is always the dehumanization of poor people and the dehumanization of like what we would now call the working class, basically, like not taking seriously the suffering of the foreigner, of the stranger, and allowing that to become normalized. Whenever that happened, you see this, that's when you see the prophets intervene and say, hey, we are not responding right to what God has called us to, the covenant that God has invited us to be in. And then lastly, the ministry of Jesus. And they point exactly to that passage you read earlier, Blair, in Luke, where Jesus is quoting from Isaiah.
Maybe we should actually read it.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna do. I'll put up. So it's Jesus, his first sermon when he comes down after his time in the wilderness, and he goes to the temple in Nazareth, and he opens up the Isaiah scroll. So it's Luke 4, 16 through 21. And he says, Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been raised. On the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue as he normally did and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the synagogue assistant, and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. He began to explain to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled, just as you heard it." Now, this is radical on any number of levels. And I'll turn it over to y'all in a second to maybe talk about the 18 and 19, because I think that's important. But I want to focus on just quickly on verse 21. What Jesus is doing when he's saying the scripture has been fulfilled as you have heard it is essentially offering a corrective to a passage in Isaiah 60, where this is taken from, where it ends after proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. It goes on to talk about God's vengeance. And Jesus ends it. He doesn't get to God's vengeance. He cuts it off. And he says, actually, no, that was a mistake. It's not about vengeance. It's not about revenge. It's actually about liberating all people from oppression. And so when he says it has been fulfilled just as you heard it, this is why the community starts freaking out, because they're like, wait, that's not what it says. And Jesus edits it. He's like, no, this is what it ought be. This is what it's supposed to be. And so you see this move to include all people without this kind of myth of redemptive violence is what's scary, why they try to run him out of town. And so this is why I love this passage. Like I could, as you, I mean, I'm preaching right now, but like for me, I'm like, there's so much here that's so rich that I think offers us a corrective to the liberative tradition that Jesus is inviting us to. So yeah, I'm just curious around y'all's interpretation, of those texts, or just the way in which you perhaps read the Bible as kind of liberative, as I know all of you had already kind of started gesturing towards.
So actually, this is one of my favorite scriptures. It's just a thing that I think about all the time. It's like, what did God come for? What did Jesus come for? What did God send what did he come to earth for? And it is to bring good news to the poor. That's like my favorite part. That's one of my favorite scriptures.
And I think that for me, was really helpful was when we had Dr. Krinks, and he talked about that passage within the framework of abolition. And that was really helpful for me. And as you probably have heard me shift when I'm preaching around those, talking about abolishing the conditions that create hell on earth. Because I think that's a better way for us to understand what that actually means today. And why I think some people struggle to understand the political nature of Jesus' message, because it feels individualistic. But in fact, Jesus understands that humans are part of systems. And so there is no separation of the two. And so for me, I just find it really persuasive. Blair, did you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, going back to the initial question you asked of us is like, why is there liberation theology? And I think there are kind of two reasons. One, we have a Christianity that was co-opted by Christendom and made political to oppress. And so there was a necessity to overturn that. So in some ways you could say the Protestant Reformation is a part of liberation theology, because it was pressing back on oppressive alignment of Christianity and power. Dare I even say, some of Calvin's thinking is a pushback on a little bit. I know.
Little bit.
If you look at his actual political circumstances,
yeah.
Calvin and some of the other Protestant reformers were trying to push back on a church that was overly controlling. It was dominating the people, spiritually and politically. And so essentially every time the church has aligned itself with the wrong kind of power, not God's power, not liberative power, not power of the people, but
state power,
power of empire, power of violence, there have been movements that push back and remind this thread of liberation as part of our story. But then, of course, why did we need liberation theology as it developed in the 1960s and 1970s? Is because then after Calvin and the Protestant Reformation, we get the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and the increase in individualism that we know leads to then all sorts of destructive theologies like manifest destiny and spiritual personalism that is about the individual's salvation and not the individual being spiritually liberated, right? And that language gets co-opted into something that doesn't align with this statement from Jesus in Luke. And so theology in the story of Christianity is constantly in flux, moving and responding to what's happening in the world and how people need to hear God's message of the incarnation and the resurrection, how that needs to be communicated and what it means for us has to change based on how humans are interacting with each other and telling the story. And so liberation theology is perhaps one of the most recent versions of Christianity has been co-opted by something that it's not. And we need to reaffirm and re-engage with the actual stories and the actual work of Jesus in the world.
I really agree with you. There's a critique of specifically like liberation theology. I have normally heard it just called Black liberation theology, I think especially in the context of James Cone. We did like a unit on this with the kids for Black History Month. And one of the articles that I read ended up being like a Black Liberation Theology, how to detect it and get rid of it in your church. One of the critiques in that was basically that in saying that Jesus's story is for the oppressed, specifically for Black people, we are like dividing who has access to salvation and to Jesus's story, which I mean, I also thought that was like in the same way that when Elphaba was Black, all of a sudden a bunch of people were like, what do you mean Elphaba's Black? If Elphaba's Black, I can't relate to Elphaba. And so the argument in the article was like, if Jesus is Black, Jesus is not for everyone, which is obviously not true. But what would you say to the people that are like, liberation theology makes Christianity not for everyone?
What they would say, and I think probably a helpful way to kind of get at this is recognizing that the way Cohn puts it is there is no such thing as a nonpartisan theology. Theology is always identified with a particular community. It is either identified with those who inflict oppression or those who are its victims. And I think the clear thing that he's suggesting is that everybody that is victim to sin, which is all human beings, are oppressed. Jesus is prioritizing, they argue, that God, by centering the voices and experiences of those who are oppressed and by lifting them up, are thereby liberating people from the systems of oppression. Not just the people who are oppressed, but also the people who have moralized oppression in the ways in which that has turned their hearts against their true humanity, right? Turned them away from the Spirit of God and allowed them to moralize failing to love to such an extent that it actually has blinded them to the essence of the gospel. And so in this sense, it's not that it's not liberating them from oppression. It is liberating them from the oppressiveness of their own selfishness, the oppressive systems that they've created that have actually captured them and made them unable to see the harm that they are actively doing. The thing that you referenced earlier, Everest, I think the struggle for some people is that it forces them to confront the truth of the ways in which they have done this harm. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to do that, right? Rather than confronting this uncomfortable truth, they rather believe the lie, right? And so I think that was the job of the prophets. That's what I'm saying. That's at its core, liberation theology is doing what the prophets do within the biblical tradition. They're like, that's what I got Richard Rohr's book down, The Tiers of Things, because I was trying to find how he described it. He talks about order, disorder, reorder. Like, liberation theologians remind us that like we're in a period of disorder and you can't pretend that we're not. And so what does reordering look like? And so I think it's like the people who say, if you say Black Lives Matter, it's like saying white lives don't. Like, that's not what it's saying. It's saying you actually have to honor Black lives.
All lives matter theology argument. Yeah.
And so I part of me, it's an invitation for them to turn inward and say, why, if centering the suffering of others, do you feel like it denies your suffering? It's not saying that God doesn't care about you. It's saying that God prioritizes these folks and God cares about you because you actually have helped enable and allow systems to exist that actually harm them, which is actually harming your own spiritual self. It's a different kind of suffering.
Essentially, people reject liberation theology because of white fragility translated into Christian fragility. Like, if you disrupt my understanding of this worldview, then the problem must be you, not that my worldview is actually flawed. And so folks will do whatever kind of mental gymnastics they need to not give up on how they think the world works, including rejecting the scripture itself.
I want to acknowledge that this is not easy for those of you who are listening to this, who perhaps are being exposed to this for the first time. And I'll talk more about like what you can do to tend to that reactivity. But I do know this may be, you're like, I hadn't really thought about this. And so that's a normal reaction. So let's get to the break. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the key themes and some of the critiques that people have on liberation theology and how people like me are kind of addressing some of those shortcomings. Thanks for listening to the Progressive Christians podcast. If you are watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please rate subscribe, and leave a comment. If you like what you have listened to so far, please consider becoming a supporter of the Progressive Christians podcast. You can find a link to make a tax-deductible donation in our show notes. A one-time donation would be great, or you can sign up to be a monthly supporter. We decided to shift to a supporter model because we don't want to deny anyone access to some of the content that we are planning to create. But in order to do this, we really do need your support to help grow our ministry, to continue to be able to reach people who are looking for a community like ours. When you sign up in the next few weeks, we are working out the kinks. You'll receive an email that will welcome you into the Love Your Neighbor Kind of Christians family. And we're going to be working to create a newsletter. We are actively producing, we have one special episode that we're going to do. There's a young adult group that actually listens to our podcast that's been using it for some of their like educational material, I guess, or conversations, and which is awesome. It's a church in Ohio. Give them a shout out. And we're going to do a special episode where we're going to answer some questions that they're submitting, which is what I'm really excited about. And so we're trying to just do stuff to really engage you all, to tell you how much we appreciate you supporting and listening to us. We have some ideas of things we can create, but we want to hear from you all. Are there any resources or things that come to mind that you think you would like us to create, or topics you'd like us to discuss? Please let us know. You can email us at progressivechristians@theloftla.org. And we'd love to hear feedback and suggestions, and again, ideas for content and ways to help you practice your faith. Welcome back to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the Love Your Neighbor Kind of Christians, and not the Storm the Capitol kind. And in our conversation around liberation theology, I know we had just started kind of getting to some of the key themes, and I think this will allow us to kind of continue to expand on the conversation we were having earlier, Everest, around who feels excluded from this. And so for the way that Gutierrez describes liberation theology is he would argue that it has a preferential option for the poor. He wrote that liberation theology asserts that God has a special concern for the marginalized, and it urges Christians to prioritize the poor in both thought and action. And so again, for them, it's about praxis. It's not just around like saying the right kind of thing. It's really judging you on what you do rather than what you say, as your actions really demonstrate what your core beliefs are. And to an extent, Everest, I think that is can be uncomfortable for some folks too, is it's inviting people to engage in their everyday life, in their political life, in ways that are also upsetting, not just theologically, but it's saying, hey, if you actually believe that people shouldn't be poor, right? If you actually believe in what Jesus is saying, then you have to actually do the things, and then they don't have excuses that they can lean back on to say, well, your suffering is because of your sin, rather than enabling systems that allow us to normalize people's poverty and suffering, right? And so I think all these things are interconnected, and it's hard to disentangle them. Blair?
And I want to note that liberation theology is not just saying we should help the poor or be among the poor. It is saying God reveals God's self in a special and unique way to people who experience poverty and oppression. And it is not just that we need to seek to end poverty and oppression, but that we need to listen to the theological insights of those who are poor and oppressed, because God is with them in a way that God is not with the privileged and the oppressor. And I think that is something different that this contemporary strand of liberation theology is doing, that it isn't necessarily seen in these ancient threads of the gospel is about liberation. This particular focus on the theological insights and experiences is a unique position that academic liberation theology is calling us to, and has just exploded into such a rich a rich tapestry of theological insight in the modern era that we haven't had before.
Yeah, I mean, because we haven't considered those voices as voices worth listening to, even though these were the voices that are the origin of the Christian movement, what becomes Christianity. Julia, I know you had a question you had talked about in our pre-show that I think is helpful to kind of tease out now about salvation, that I think kind of ties into essentially the doing of theology. I think might be helpful.
In my current location, I hear this word a lot, salvation. No one can actually define it for me. And yet, a few weeks ago, Reverend Blair, you made a comment, and you said when they say salvation, where we would say liberation. And I was like, oh, that's why I don't know what it is, because I've never heard that word. But also in the meanwhile, so now when I do hear it, I try to like in my brain be like, they say salvation, they mean liberation, but it doesn't, it's not matching.
But
It's
then you
not
have
the
to
same
ask
thing.
liberation from what? And liberation towards what?
And so what is the difference between salvation and liberation?
Well, I think many of the place you are theologically, it's a more moderate. One might say it's
Me
more
personally or me physically?
institution. The institution
Thank you. Sorry. Yes. No. Okay,
not you.
great.
Yeah,
Environment you're in.
No, we're
The
in the same.
institution you're
Okay,
in,
got it.
yeah, is they're still thinking about salvation, perhaps from a perspective of like literally being saved from hell, and they're talking about an eschatology, right? This idea of eternal salvation. They are not taking seriously, probably, from what it sounds like you're saying, the conditions that people are currently in. And so their focus and their belief, their theological belief, is that Jesus is the primary mission of Christianity is to, as I heard it growing up, flee the wrath to come, like to escape, to not go to hell. And what liberation theology is arguing, building on Jesus and the prophets and Moses, like not just pulling it out of nowhere. Like actually, it's both, right? When Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God in Mark, when he first comes in, right, it's not this far off thing. It is something it's both and. We're supposed to be working towards abolishing those systems of that create hell on earth so that we can live in the kingdom of God or the beloved community. And also knowing that we won't fully experience it until we get to that time when Christ does return, right? And I think this is what we're talking about when we're talking about we understand that salvation is praxis. It is the doing of religion. It is creating the conditions so that people can be full human beings in their dignity, right? Be recognized. And I think when we make it so spiritual and forget that we are embodied spirits, right? That we're not being honest with the text. That we're not being honest with what Jesus is doing. And we're honestly doing it in a way so that we can justify the systems that don't require us to change and give up power and money and privilege, which is something that those of us in positions of privilege have to do, including myself. Like I'm not sitting here on this high horse saying, that I'm right. Like I know like where I sit in this scheme, but I also know that if I have to give up something for the greater good, then it just makes sense because it's going to also benefit me. But anyway, like I don't understand these people can't think like this, but that's just my brain. So that's what I think is some of the difference with liberation theology. It takes seriously salvation in both this life and the next. Blair, is that kind of alignment with what you were going to say or what you were thinking?
I think you nailed it. And that's one reason I love, especially when folks read the Latin American liberation theologians, is there's this argument between, is the focus of the church supposed to be human flourishing and creation care and overturning oppression, or is it supposed to be on spiritual liberation? Because if you think like my future is I'm going to burn in hell for all eternity, then to find out that you're not, that is a kind of liberation. Like that is life changing. That is transformative. And I love the way in which the Latin American liberation theologians especially interweave these things and say one does not exist without the other. They require each other, that the eschatological reality is both now and to come. That is what the incarnation means. It's not that God is separate from us anymore. God's love and God's purpose and the day of the Lord is among us and also will be fully experienced. So in Black liberation theologians do this very well as well. There's a lot of interweaving of the eschatological present and future. In feminist theology, we talk about it as Advent theology, as the already and the not yet. But this, especially people who critique liberation theology for saying it's not spiritual enough, they obviously haven't read it, right? Like they actually haven't read the writing of these people because they are deeply spiritually engaged.
Yeah, I know, Julie, you had a question, and I think it's one of the critiques I got on my book, Blair, was in both my monograph and the second edited volume was the amount of Bible I wanted to use. And my editor was like, "There's too much Bible because you're not a Bible scholar." But like within my tradition, I'm like, no, I got to justify what I'm saying, and they're not going to take it seriously if they don't see me working with the Bible. you know? Yeah, I think that's the difference, that it's deeply spiritual and engaging with the text. But Julie, I know you had a question.
Well, no, I guess what you're saying, Blair, makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. The idea that like what we do here, the way that like, shouldn't our faith lead us to behave in certain ways? And that is what then leads us to salvation. Like the spiritual act should be, in my opinion, like what I've always understood it to be, was the way that we behave here in working to bring about God's kingdom on earth. And then if there is an afterlife, that is the thing that brings you to salvation. Less worried about like, do you swear, do you drink?
I mean, that is how I understand it. And I would say like, it's James, that's what I was trying to find it here, like James 2:14, where he's talking, just the distinction of faith and works. I think that's the challenge people have always had. And I think that there's always been this wrestling. And that's why I said I always point to the book of James, because I think it does a good job of helping us recognize that like you can't be a hearer of the word and not be doing anything. Because as James would say, deceive yourself, right? And I think that's something that we forget. I mean, those people who want to push back on the kind of changes we ought to be making in this world. I also want to say too, like, so the way this gets distinguished between like Latin American liberation and like Black liberation, and some of the things that Everest you mentioned earlier, this kind of goes back to that article around some people feeling comfortable, is they would read Cone. And so I just taught Cone in my systematic theology class. And Cone identifies, he's like, God is Black. But he just flat out says it. And I'm telling you, anytime I'm teaching that, and some of my like white students read it, they're just like, I mean, they're like, and even some Black folks, it makes them uncomfortable, right? And that's why I had that one colorblind quote that I read earlier, because I think that is important, for us to understand it. So Cone writes, in a racist society, God is never colorblind. This is analogous to saying God is blind to justice. And so for Cone, Blackness for him isn't like a racial category. It's what he calls an ontological category. I'm gonna have to explain this because I know this is a big word, but he writes, Blackness is an ontological symbol in a visible reality that best describes what oppression means in America. And so for Cone, what he's saying is not that God is actually like racially Black, but by saying God is Black, he's saying that God understands suffering, that and the best way to talk about God understanding suffering is to say God is Black, because to be in America is to experience suffering, is a part of what he's saying. I'm going to get to some critiques. Some Black people probably listen to this and be like, it's more complicated than that. And I would agree. But I think for Cone, at the time he was writing it, it forced and it shook people up in a way that I know he wanted to galvanize them to think critically about the normalization of Black suffering in light of the way Christian theology had been practiced up until that moment. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important, and it did its job insofar as it forced people to wrestle with the way in which God has been racialized as white and what that did, right? When we know God wasn't European, Jesus, right? Jesus wasn't European, right? And so anyway, I think that's something to understand, that people who feel when your voice has been privileged and centered for so long, when it's not given that privilege and it's not centered, it feels like oppression, when in fact it is just actually amplifying voices that have been at the margins. It's not that your voice doesn't matter or that your perspective doesn't matter. It's that it has mattered so much, it's drowned out other voices that we now need to actually listen to. And I think that's key.
And I think that's a key difference too between liberation theology and the social gospel, because the social gospel was largely carried out by white American and Western European folks who, because they took salvation in this life very seriously. I would say too, like John Wesley is part of this, the roots of social gospel movement, which is essentially, if I am saved and I desire to see others saved and a part of the kingdom of heaven, then I have to enact that in the world. But the motivation was not, I need to pay attention to who is suffering because that is where I will find God, which is what Matthew 25 calls us to, right? Christ says, we're caring for your neighbor. And they ask, when did we care for you? And Jesus says, when I was in prison, you visited me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. So it's about meeting Christ in those who suffer. That wasn't necessarily the motivation of the social gospel and Wesley's social practices in the way that liberation theologians are thinking about this privilege of the poor, right? The social gospel is in some ways what leads to white saviorism and the international mission movement. That is just an extension of colonialism, where white people feel bad that suffering exists, and because they're motivated by a spiritual salvation, want to see suffering stop, but they don't actually embrace the ontological, as Dr. Carter says, the ontological and theological privilege that Christ is amongst the poor. And that requires an actual flipping of the world, that those who are poor are the ones who should be making decisions about how we organize our society, who should be leading our theological reflections, who should be at the front of our liturgical processions and rituals. Like, it actually calls for an upside down kingdom. Whereas the social gospel says we're going to fix those things, but it still allows for a privileged class. And I think that's, again, where liberation theology and the social gospel deviate from one another.
Well, I think as I was listening to you say that, I also think it's really interesting that I think a lot of people remember Jesus and think of Jesus kind of like post resurrection in like, you know, we have the images of him in like the golden robes and the like coming in glory, and there's a bunch of light behind him, and all of the imagery is very, not only very white, but like very clean. And I think hearing you say that, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense to me that one of the most challenging parts of this would be actually really asking yourself to see God in the faces of people that are like the most looked down upon, the most oppressed, the most unclean, which is what Jesus did. But that would really, it's a real challenge in the brain.
Marcus Borg, in his book Jesus Uncovering the Life, Teachings, and Relevance of a Religious Revolutionary, does a great job of talking about pre-Easter and post-Easter Jesus. And I, in my current sermon series, like I dance, I don't dance, I dabble, because it's something that it's uncomfortable to people when you actually hit the historical context that prior to his death, like, people didn't believe Jesus was God, right? And it's the resurrection that you get this post-Easter shift. And so to sit with that for some people is uncomfortable. And so from a sermonic perspective, you have to make sure you walk people to this understanding. I'm not saying Jesus wasn't God, but I am saying that when we read Jesus in the Gospels, we have to understand the context that he's engaging these people and the way they were responding to him shifts after the resurrection, right? I do think so often when we think about, if we sit with that reality, it helps us understand much more of the social and political conditions, why Jesus was resisting them, not only because they're wrong and evil, but the radical nature of him doing it and how it galvanized his community and created a following because he was honestly trying to center the poor and the dispossessed and those who are marginalized. And we see this kind of leads to the other key theme of liberation theology, which is the kind of integration of faith and social justice. And so for Gutierrez, he would talk a lot about, like, he had these three kind of pillars: political liberation, psychological liberation, and liberation from sin. And so political liberation is about changing structures that cause harm and eliminating injustice. Psychological liberation is like actually allowing people to be fully able to be themselves and be free. He says liberation encompasses freeing the individual from those things that limit the capacity to develop themselves freely and in dignity. And so you're talking about like Jim and Jane Crow, you're talking about sexism, queer hate, like all those things that make it such that you carry the weight in reality of suffering and death because of just who you are and how that wears you down over time, right? And lastly, liberation from sin. And this is the freedom that we find in Christ, like a freedom from sin and selfishness. It's what we Methodists would call like Christian perfection. Like, it is growing towards God so that we no longer fail to bother to love. And so for each of them, they saw all these things as kind of working together. They see this in the biblical text, and they see it as the way in which for them it's supposed to play out and how we practice being Christian. I do want to make sure we spend time on some critiques because I think that's important. So I'll go ahead and toss to Blair. Go ahead.
Well, one of the critiques, we've talked about how liberation theology focusing on particular experiences of particular people. That's one of the critiques, right? That somehow that excludes everyone else. We've tackled that one. Another critique is that liberation theology is too political and doesn't take sin seriously. And my argument would be, again, if you actually read Benino and Gutierrez and Cohn and Dolores Williams and Mary Daly, they actually take sin incredibly seriously. They just recognize that sin is not only an individual phenomenon, but that sin also exists in social systems. And they take that sin and the overturning of that sin incredibly seriously. And so that's one of the critiques that just drives me insane, is because that is evidence to me that you've not actually read any liberation theologians. You've just decided that liberation theology is a boogeyman. The argument that people get into when they do start to read is that the claim about social sin or systemic sin is too grounded in Marxist sociological thought, and the idea that justice and injustice are grounded in systems and not just individual actions. And I understand a critique of relying too much on Marxism, because Marxism is very anti-theistic, ultimately. Marx philosophy, calls religion the opium of the masses, right? So I understand the critique of not wanting to ground a theology in something that is anti-theological, but I think that the concept of sociological observation of human systems that are larger than the actions of individuals is not something only Marx does. So
100%.
we have to get over that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Marxist, so it's like, this is not like rock. Anybody listening to this podcast, you know this, and so like, you don't have to believe everything that Marx wrote to realize there's a lot in there that's helpful. Marx was critique of institutional religion because he realized how people used it to justify oppression. That's what he's critiquing when he says it's the opiate of the people.
Absolutely.
He's like, people, and I mean, look at what's happening now. You know what I'm saying? All we gotta do is look at what's happening now. Look at the people who are all talking about Jesus, 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 God, 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 God bless America, maybe all this other stuff. And look at what they're actually doing. This is like,
his
it's shining
critique
from
was not wrong.
Yeah. I'm
right?
like,
it's telling poor people who are suffering to say, the church was saying, but you have liberation in heaven. You can have abundance in your spirit. And so therefore the suffering you're experiencing in this world doesn't matter. And that was a theological development that was used to maintain oppression and privilege and those systems. So that critique of Christianity, I carry as well.
I think that the reason people are upset with the Marxist analytical voice, that's especially in Latin American theology, but also within Black liberation theology as well, is that it is decidedly political, and it's calling for the redistribution of wealth that makes capitalists uncomfortable. That makes Christians who are capitalists uncomfortable. They ain't trying to redistribute the wealth.
Well, that is exactly what I was going to say. Is like, in the same way that Blair pointed out that like liberation theology academically exists pretty new, and the practices have existed and the ideas have existed way long before. Maybe this is a hot take, but it feels like the actual ministry of Jesus, the apostolic church, the early days did have a lot of like kind of Marxist values, and Marxism came way later, and like there's obviously a lot of different parts of that ideology that do not necessarily align with our faith. But I think that being like, oh, that guy put some things into words that are ideas that actually already were present here, like that is different than superimposing Marxism on top of our faith. That critique also, I'm like, well, I mean, let's talk about like abundance and redistribution at the very beginning, and then look at how the way that this is worded aligns with that. And it doesn't feel like too much of a stretch to me.
I want to
that is in the Bible.
To the last critique, and this is, I think, a very fair critique on one hand, is the way in which, while the early writers of liberation theology, particularly Cohn and Gutierrez, talk a lot about racial and political oppression, they were not people who were very intersectional. So they especially didn't talk about gender and sexuality. They were nowhere near talking about disability. And I think that was a fair critique. Also, I want to be fair to Cohn in particular, and I can speak to him more than I can speak about Gutierrez. So maybe if someone's listening to this who knows more about this can send a note, and I will talk about it next week. Cohn was aware of that. And so what he did in the 80s was really created this space for some of the earliest womanist scholars like Emily Towns and like Katie Cannon and these other folks to come there and study and give them space to say, it matters that you're a woman. I don't know how it's going to, but it's going to matter how you're constructing theology. And so they talked about how he was one of the few people who gave them a space when they were experiencing so much sexism in seminary. Like, they all talk about how they experienced racism before seminary, and they got to seminary and it was crazy patriarchal. And so I can give him that, and to say he recognized the shortcomings and tried to address them as he got older. But clearly in his early work, the reason womanist theology exists is in part because of the inability of Black theology to take the intersectional oppression seriously. So Blair, is there anything you want to add to that from a feminist perspective, or about Gutierrez or anything?
No, I don't think there's any particular critiques. And to some extent, the critique is keep going, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Don't like, it wasn't bad that Cone spoke out of Cone's own experience. It wasn't bad that Gutierrez spoke out of Gutierrez's own experience. And I think it would have been inappropriate for them to try to understand how being a woman amplifies economic injustice and racial injustice. So it's not necessarily a critique of like they did something wrong. It's that there's more. So, and as you said, keep going, do disability justice, do queer justice, like wherever there is oppression, go find the voices of those who are experiencing it and listen for what God is doing amongst them.
Yeah. I mean, I know I take it and I add, a distinctly ecological spin to it. And so I talk about anti-oppression in the ways in which that should make us think about how we engage non-human nature and all animals, creation, everything. And so yeah, it is a keep going. So I want to wrap up, as we have been doing the last few weeks, by getting to some good news. And the first good news I want to get to, I'm going to turn over to Blair and let Blair share her good news.
I just found out I'm a found Canadian, is what they're calling us. There's a new law that went into effect in Canada where citizenship used to only be available to those born outside of Canada to one generation. There were some lawsuits, and the Canadian government basically looked at how messed up the system had been for claiming citizenship and said, if you can prove that you are the direct descendant of someone who has ever resided in Canada for an extensive amount of time, or who has held Canadian citizenship, you are a Canadian. Send us your documentation and you can come on home, you can get a passport. And so it's been a huge relief. I'm in that process of gathering all of my family's documents. And the big relief is not necessarily that I'm going to move to Canada, but that we have been watching what's happening politically and knowing that when one group is targeted and oppressed, that very quickly that can roll into other groups. And so I've been deeply concerned for my son, who is autistic, and the way in which JFK talks about autistic people, that we might need to find a pathway to get my son out of the country. And this now is opening a door. And so I'm just really grateful that the Canadian government decided to open the door to right some historic wrongs and create this pathway. And I know that a lot of queer folks and trans folks are submitting their applications with a rush on it and getting approved really quickly. So I just want to encourage everyone, go check out your family tree, see if you've got any Canadians in that line. And you might have some different kinds of national opportunities.
Yeah, I know. So it was, I think you said JFK, but I know you meant RFK.
Yes, I meant RFK. Thank you.
We don't want to
Thank
tarnish.
you for clarifying.
Yeah, no, I think, and the damage that they are doing, it's insane. Like, it is, it's measles. That's all I gotta say. Just look it up, Google it, and see what's happening. Like, it's really, really bad. The other good news is Michigan has filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against 4 major fossil fuel companies and the top U.S. oil lobbying group for its role in fueling the climate crisis and rising energy costs, which is like great, because this was an issue when I lived there in terms of especially the cost of energy in that state and how much we were paying. So I'm hopeful that this actually makes some momentum and inroads. And lastly, in light of President's Day, Trump's approval ratings are lower than ever. According to Yahoo News, the president's disapproval rating has risen to 58%, up from 56% last month. And that is also an all-time high, because he is
a monster.
You can fill in a blank.
I love that you put that with the good news.
It is. Because just like, I want people to know, like, everybody knows this dude's doing a terrible job. This dude,
people are
tanking in the polls.
paying attention. People are
Yeah.
people are jumping ship, and
Yeah.
that means some people are having their eyes open to the cult that they've been part of, and that's really hard to do.
And I want to, and this isn't really the good news necessarily, but something I just want to lift up. I just saw on New York Times this morning that Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away today. And for those of you who are, especially Black children in the 80s and 90s, Jesse Jackson was an omnipresent figure in the way we were taught to remember the connection to the civil rights movement, the connection to King, the work he tried to do and continue to do in his run for presidency in 84 and 88, but most especially how he commanded a presence and spoke with a particular kind of authority that he felt like that we could belong in those spaces that weren't necessarily for us. And quite honestly, the work that Jesse Jackson did in Chicago, I mean, I think you could see a through line from him to Obama, like laying the groundwork as community organizing and whatnot. And so it's amazing. And so, we lost an ancestor, and may his soul be at rest and at peace in this time. Well, thank you all for listening to the Progressive Christians podcast. The Progressive Christian podcast is a ministry of The Loft, a worship community of Westway Methodist Church. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on all social media platforms at The Progressive Christians. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at progressivechristians@theloftla.org. Our show is produced by our amazing producer, Spencer, and it is mixed and edited by our wonderful audio engineer, AJ. If you like the show, please rate, share, review, subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
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 Bye.